and good evening and welcome to the church. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Sarah Cochran. I am Executive Director and Chief Curator. I have a very important job, which is to ask you to either turn off your cell phones or silence them. So thank you for that scramble. The other thing is that we are, obviously we have the wonderful exhibition upstairs, Road Rage, and if you haven't seen it, please do come back. We'll open tomorrow our doors at 11 a.m. until 5. Basically, if you're at the church between 12 and 5 every afternoon, except for Tuesdays, we'll let you in. But on Tuesdays, we have to clean the place. So that's our excuse for being closed one day a week. Secondly, we do have a lot of events going on. If you are not on our mailing list, please sign up. We do not share, but we do have lots of interesting things to do. And so that is it for the formalities of the evening. I would now just like to welcome our two speakers. Obviously, you probably know and admire both of them as I do. But tonight we have the great honor of being here with Robert Rubin, who is of course a financier and former financier, owner of The Bridge, a collector of art, cars, screenplays, architecture, and no doubt many other lovely things. We are particularly grateful to Bob for being here tonight, and also to him for all of his support of this exhibition. He's a major lender to us, and he confirmed the idea that a show about contemporary art and cars was a great idea. So thank you, Bob, for all of your support of the exhibition, and thank you for being here. And interviewing him will be Alastair Gordon, a journalist, author, editor, noted scholar on architecture, Scotsman. It turns out we were born within probably about 5 miles of each other, which means this gentleman looks excellent in a kilt. And we look forward to having an excuse to show that off. So please join me in welcoming Alastair and Bob, and thank you for being here again.
Do we need these? Yeah, I guess. Thank you very much, Sarah. And it is true that we were born within 5 miles of each other. And I used to look good in a kilt. And I would have brought one if I'd known. It's a huge pleasure to meet with my old friend, Bob Rubin, again. I think we met high school 50 years ago. Okay, that's the truth. So we've been going back and forth for a long, long time. And, you know, we always have these, at least every 2 years we have these conversations at a museum or a gallery or something, and it's kind of free form, we just make it up and we see what goes along. But there is structure to this road rage, and there's structure to this seeming chaotic kind of thing. So I just thought I'd start with what I felt was the centerpiece of the show, which is an amazing car by Kristen Morgan made out of clay. And for a lot of reasons, A, that it's such a major piece, but B, that it tells me a lot about Bob's sensibility as a collector and as someone who is not only obsessed with cars over the years, but has an amazing eye for art and design and architecture. Tell us about how you came to this and how you purchased this or found it.
Well, Kristen Morgan is an artist ceramicist who lives in Los Angeles and teaches at one of the UC schools there. And I had seen a sculpture of a 48 Hudson, 48 or 49, which is of course the car that Jack Kerouac and Neil Cassidy drove in on the road. Dean Moriarty, right, the name of the character. And it looked like it had just been dredged up from the bottom of a body of water. And I got a hold of the artist and I said, I would like you to make me a car. And I explained to her why, and the history of the racetrack and everything else. And she said, I'll give you 3 choices. I'll either do James Dean's Wrecked Spider, I'm sorry, 2 choices. James Dean's Wrecked Spider or Robert Smithson's pickup truck.
Oh my gosh.
And I thought that Robert Smithson's pickup truck was a little bit obscure for the members of the bridge, and that James Dean was a little more accessible to the general public, so I went for the Spider. I mean, James Dean was quite a successful amateur racer in California.
So it's based exactly on this
Yes.
130
Yes.
Spider, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. Which he drove. And then this is the theme. When I was going through all this material, I was thinking you could do a whole history, cultural history of the 20th century American art through the car crashes that have happened. So this is when he died, September 30th, 1955.
Right.
So I
It was
didn't
a
realize you...
gruesome accident. He was going
Horrible.
145 miles an hour, and some guy pulled out.
Right. And he was on his way to race the car,
Yes.
I think, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
exactly.
Was it Nevada or
California.
California? This made me think of, this is sort of back, and it's not really an interview, it's kind of a double interview, but the whole notion of the American road and the American car. Henry Miller and so many other American expats came back from Europe when the World War II started, and his first pass was driving around America, being horrified, and wrote this book called The Air-Conditioned Nightmare. We passed bridges, railroad tracks, warehouses, factories, and whatnot. It was like following in the wake of a demented giant who had sown the earth with crazy dreams. Henry never held back. And following that, and actually Kerouac, Bob just mentioned Kerouac, on one of, this is Jack Kerouac's early journal, 47, 48, and you can see him on his way out the northern way to the west coast. One of the first places he wanted to go was Big Sur to see Henry Miller, and he managed to visit him and kind of following in his footsteps. And of course wrote on the road, nothing behind me, everything ahead of me is ever so on the road. And not just kind of reinventing the American Wild West narrative, but inventing a new kind of, I'm sure it had been done before, but he sort of claims the victory of it as this unbroken piece of typewriter paper.
Yeah,
that he scrolled through the
right, there's a
typewriter.
connection between the idea of on the road and stream of consciousness
Absolutely.
writing, which
Exactly.
kind of supplanted the formalism of American literature.
So the idea was to take a lot of amphetamine and
Right.
then just sit down. And I think he wrote it in about, I think the Subterraneans he wrote in one sitting, apparently, supposedly,
Right.
according to Ginsberg. This, I think, took a couple of weeks, but still pretty fast. And then I just wanted to tie it in and jump in here, Bob, at any point. You know, this sort of American tragedy of this idea of space. And Pollock, as our local hero, fits so much into that myth of the kind of the tough, rough cowboy. In fact, he wasn't. He was pretty brilliant. My dad used to go see him and drink vodka with him in his studio in Springs, and he said how smart he was. And, he would talk theology and philosophy with them, which sort of blew the image in my mind. And of course, here's another terrible car crash. August 11th, 1956, coming around a corner drunk on Springs Fireplace Road. That we know. And then it's sort of opening up with Kennedy's death. I think this year, 63, 64, 65, there's so much art that's coming out. This is Andy Warhol's Death and Disaster series. It was the same photograph by John Whitehead. It was a horrible accident in Seattle that he documented for Newsweek, and Warhol picked up and repeated it with many, I think 5 different versions, right, with each one a different color. There's the black one. Same year, 1963, Roy Lichtenstein in the car. One of Christo's very first rap pieces, too, was 1963, this Volkswagen. Again, I think we're going to talk about this in a minute, but this difference between the American perception of the kind of automotive horizon and this idea of kind of a utopian car world that goes out to the West with endless expanse was so different than the European ideal, which was much more intellectual, right?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, the Europeans are more obsessed with road trips and road movies because they don't have this expanse, so they're both more, it's more aestheticized, but then there's this whole strain that's more critical of the automobile
Right.
and the damage the automobile has done to society.
Right, and it's political, it's social, it's
Right.
environmental. I mean, I think of the opening scene of The Weekend, Godard, right? It's just cars trying to pass each other and then crashing into each other.
Isn't that Pierrot Le Fou?
No,
Or
I
that's-
think it's Le Weekend, yeah. Pretty sure. Does anyone else know? It's Weekend, yeah.
Okay, I stand corrected.
Yeah. And these are, you know, the Rosenquist, I think a lot of you know how many cars and trucks Jim Rosenquist used, but I found this wonderful image of early study he did with Polaroids of just two cars butted up against each other that then burned in his studio fire, so that's sort of been marked up. It's the kind of thing Bob would collect.
This is a great example of process material being at least as interesting as the art that follows.
In some ways more, I mean, because you see where it comes from. But again, he's very much in that, you know, he was a big sign painter. So Horizon just, again, it's a story I've always been interested in, and Bob knows about it. The sculpture on the left, the lower left, is actually by Jackson Pollock. It's one of the only sculptures he ever did. Tony Smith is up in the upper left there. They were very good friends. They're very good drinking friends. I luckily, when I was at Princeton, got to have the last year that Tony taught art I got to meet him and be a student of his. And they would get drunk it was near Morristown, New Jersey, Tony's place. And Tony was trying to transition from an architect to an artist, to a sculptor. And Pollock hadn't done any paintings that year, the year of his death, 56. And he came out there, and this one on the left, Pollock did. It's basically 2 or 3, you know, cleaner hangers that you get at the cleaners, just the wire hangers, covered with plaster and sand. And that's, you can see, this is Tony's on the right. You can see the shape of the hanger. I mean, it was as basic as it could be. And Tony was getting away from, you know, very local, working for artists. Theodore Stamos' house, which is still there in Greenport, 1951. Betty Parsons, not just a great gallerist, but an artist in her own right. I'm not sure if that's still there. Does anyone know? Anyway, I was digging through these a lot when I was writing a book called Weekend Utopia, which was sort of rediscovering this period. And he also did this Roman Catholic church for Alfonso Osorio, another local luminary. This was never built. So I'm not going to read this whole thing, but maybe you can if you're speed readers. This, to me, is a very important part of the whole transition around this period, 66, 67, from studio art to outdoor art, earth art, landscape art, land art. When I was teaching at Cooper, this is Tony Smith talking. It was published in Art Forum in 1966. When I was teaching at Cooper Union, someone told me, one of his students told him how I could get onto the unfinished Jersey Turnpike. He took 3 students and drove from somewhere in Meadows to New Brunswick. It was a dark night, and there were no lights or shoulder markers, lines, railings, or anything at all except the dark pavement moving through the landscape of the flats, rimmed by the hills in the distance, but punctuated by stacks, towers, fumes, and colored lights. The drive was a revealing experience. This is sort of an epiphany for Smith. The road and much of the landscape was artificial, and yet it couldn't be called a work of art. On the other hand, it did something for me that art had never done. And this...
I'm from New Jersey, and I can't imagine the New Jersey Turnpike unfinished, right?
Can you imagine getting on that and going in the dark? And there were no guardrails and just driving through. So that was, when that was published in 66, it apparently, Smithson, Heiser, De Maria, and some of the others of that generation were incredibly, you know, turned on by that and moved. This is Bob Smithson. The very next year, about a year later, he takes it again away from the gallery, the city gallery, and he's going into New Jersey because he grew up in New Jersey. But he's documenting these what he calls these monuments, and even further out. And then he did that famous piece about the Passaic River, the monuments of Passaic. So again, it's extending that roadway out away from the city into the hinterlands. And De Maria got out there first, from what I know. 68, Mile Long Drawing. Again, sort of like the road, the endless road. Michael Heiser's motorcycle drawings in Jean Dry Lake, Nevada. There's his motorcycle. And sort of the most famous one, obviously, is Spiral Jetty. But this photograph sort of reminded me of the photograph by Baudrillard in the show, somehow, again, going back to the European version of this idea of speed and the automobile. Bob.
Right. This is my favorite quote. The point is not to write the sociology or psychology of the car. The point is to drive. But this particular piece also is referring to the ecological damage of the automobile in oblique and not so oblique ways. I mean, it's a beautiful, aestheticized, it's ruin porn, I guess you could call it.
But it's interesting that where's Saint Clément? Is it south of France, right? Somewhere.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Where is Saint Clément?
The funny thing about that quote is, this is from a book he wrote called America in 1986. He is writing about the sociology and psychology of the car. I mean, so European. He's so European, right? And he's not just driving, and that's what's so great about the quote. I mean, and you go back to the beginnings of European modernism, and Marinetti wrecks his Fiat in a ditch in Milan in 1908, and he immediately aestheticizes it and philosophizes it. Within a week, he's writing the first lines of the Futures Manifesto. We affirm that the world's magnificence has been enriched by a new beauty, the beauty of speed, a racing car whose hood is domed with great pipes.
Right. This is a great example of the fact that before cars were appliances, they were toys.
Right.
And they only became appliances when people like Henry Ford realized the greater possibilities of moving you from point A to point B. But guys like Marinetti were just in it for the kicks, right?
Also, it was a rich man's game.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. The same people who owned carriages and horses traded them up for cars.
So I think we all know that what came out of Marinetti's manifesto, Bala's speeding automobile, dynamism of the car, these famous photographs, which I was fascinated by. I was thinking I'd seen this somewhere else. This is 1913 by Jacques-Henri Lartigue. And then Man Ray, 10 years later almost, is his friend Picabia, the Dadaist, who was a car fanatic, racing. Kind of the same kind of distortion. And then it leads up to talk about theory, not just driving. Corbusier, you pick up here, Bob, if you want, because I think this is such a great picture.
Well, it's a nice transition, but I think that one of the major themes of 20th century architecture was trying to figure out how to build houses with the precision of automobiles and airplanes, but which mostly failed miserably.
Right.
He
was obsessed. Le Corbusier was obsessed with airplanes, as we know. I mean, he wrote a whole book called The Airplane. Cars, the Voisin. What is a Voisin cord? Do you know?
A Voisin cord was a automobile produced by Gabriel Voisin, which was kind of a road-going version of a Bugatti. Voisin didn't really race. He just made beautiful cars for rich people, but he was very much into this machine age aesthetic.
Because Corb would often pose this in front of one of his cars to show the comparison, along with an airplane or a ship or something. Then he did his own car, kind of ripping off Bucky a little bit, I think. He must have seen Buckminster Fuller's car by this point.
Right, the
36, because Dymaxion is 1933 in Chicago, right? Do you know anything about this?
No, it never really went anywhere. It's a concept car. They never really built a prototype. I mean, just to go back a second, I'm reminded that Jean Prouvé said that if airplane manufacturers built airplanes like we build houses, they wouldn't fly. Right? So.
That's a great line.
Right. So
this is more, again, taking two pieces, not the actual pieces, but the two artists. One is César. The one in the show you own, right? The César.
Yes.
So these compression pieces from 1960 versus John Chamberlain's about a year late. I mean, they started about the same time, but I think Chamberlain was a little bit after César's first pieces, right?
Yes.
So here we have a good example of what we're talking about, a much more intellectualized take on the culture of excess and mass production versus a much more painterly kind of artful arrangement of color and form, as if he's doing an abstract expressionist sculpture.
Yeah, César, he had this move, which was compression, and he was taking industrial detritus and compressing it, and yes, it's aesthetic, but it's more conceptual than aesthetic, whereas Chamberlain the conceptual element of recycling automobile waste is very secondary to the abstract expressionist riffing with color and shape. He's not commenting on the industrial landscape the way the Europeans are.
Yeah, you never hear him. I mean, he didn't write up much, Chamberlain, as far as I know. You don't really hear him talking that much about the theory behind these pieces, other than the experience of going. Yeah.
They're mostly aesthetic. They're aesthetic exercises.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, they're wonderful, but they're at a different end of the spectrum than César.
But I think it's great that you have the two pieces upstairs that are in the show, because they really show this.
That's Eric's curatorial choice for you. Right?
Yeah. And then this goes back to my childhood a little bit too, but more Bob's, just the obsession with the concept car. You know, the American, you have Detroit making all these mass production cars, but they're at the same time, the sexiest thing they're doing is these crazy concept cars, which how are those used? They're used to really launch new lines and
they're really used to market the idea of the automobile. It's not quite like a race car where there's a kind of a trickle-down technology.
Right.
The concept cars were just what the creative people were doing because they could.
They could.
The business was good, so they could go off and, very few of these concept cars filtered into production cars in any meaningful way. I mean, you don't see anything like that on the...
But did GM believe they increased sales? Or
I don't know. I think that it was more the creative types at the auto companies had the resources to do this, and they wanted to, and they weren't. It was a lot cheaper to build a concept car than to go racing, right?
Right. So one of the early, in a way, concept cars, but coming from a completely independent, wild source, is Bucky Fuller's Dymaxion. That he worked out the early images with this. There's a lot. I spent a lot of time at the Stanford archives, where all of Bucky Fuller's work is. And what's really extraordinary when you go there, they don't really have it well indexed. So you sort of say, I think I want to see something that's around 1933, 35, 36. And they just come, and a week later, this trolley comes in with thousands of boxes of, because he kept everything. It's the largest personal single archive in America, maybe in the world, but certainly in North America. And one thing I kept noticing throughout, especially the 30s and 40s and early 50s, he would drive and drink and get in terrible accidents. And just file after file was filled with police reports from Boston, from suburbs of Boston, where he would go, almost killing a woman and 2 children at one point. And he was so well connected in the old New England families that he kept getting, he had a cousin who was a lawyer who would bail him out. Anyway, this was his idea of and he was very close friends with Noguchi. So here's this wonderful kind of collaboration, convergence between an amazing sculptor, artist, and Fuller. Fuller was given Fortune magazine. I don't know if it was 1 issue or maybe 2 issues, but this was going to be for the cover of the magazine. This idea of purely, and he said it was, the science behind this was, I think it was all in his head. I don't think there was any science behind it, but beautiful objects. And then, of course, it was unveiled in the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. You can see there, you could go inside it. I think it says Dymaxion, see the Dymaxion car, admission 10 cents. Pretty good deal. There he is. Of course, a 3-wheel car, as Bob knows better than anyone, is not the safest car.
These were a disaster to drive, but...
And we know that because...
It crashed.
Yeah, and killed the driver. Yeah, literally a week later after they unveiled it. So again, he was always, he had this sort of legacy, this karma of car wrecks. And I understood a lot more about what happened here after I saw all these. No one's, again, has indexed these police records of Bucky's. Unfortunately, Allegra, his daughter, who just died, like literally a week ago or something like that. And she really was an amazing, keeper of the flame, but she also didn't want anyone to remember or know about that side of her dad, so a lot of this material, I don't think it was suppressed, it just hasn't been kind of come out in the open. So the ultimate, sort of porn fest concept car with these GM Motoramas, this was at the Waldorf Astoria in 1954. Do you know anything about this, Bob?
No, but this was a little before my time. But I remember going to the auto shows at the Coliseum in the early '60s and
there'd always be a concept car in the middle.
Salivating over the concept cars.
So this was Lincoln Futura in 1954, which turns out to be the sort of Batmobile.
Right. It's like the Jetsons.
It's like the Jetsons.
Right.
And then this company called, what is it called again? Barris, right?
Yeah, Chuck Barris.
Chuck Barris of Custom City in LA, right? So they did all the movie cars, and they would take a car from line. So this was taken from the Futura and then added onto, and eventually became the Batmobile.
Yeah, so the concept cars tended to filter out more into culture than into actual automobile manufacture.
Right. For Hollywood movies.
Right, well, yeah, the Batmobile.
Yeah.
And then it circled back because Alfa Romeo made a series of cars that were actually quite beautiful based on the Batmobile.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
So,
and this is where Bob and I kind of converged when we were probably 10 years old or something, or 12 years old, was making Big Ed Roth. Does anyone remember Big Daddy Ed Roth? I mean, he was like a Dadaist almost, right? He went from one of those car body fanatics in Southern California into, I mean, that's a great picture.
Well, at a certain moment in time, he had the pre-adolescent youth of America in his thrall. I made the model of the Beatnik Bandit when I was a kid, and you'd get these catalogs where you could write away for pinstriping kits and things like that, and he invented the Ratfink. Right.
But it was crazy. It was sort of pre-revolutionary. It was like pre-hippie, pre-counterculture.
Right.
And I think a lot of Southern California surfers and hippie surfers were very into Big Daddy, and I think he was pretty. What happened to Big Daddy? Do we know?
He's been dead for a while. Okay. He was on the circuit, in the '80s, going to revival shows and selling T-shirts and stuff like that, and then he died.
And this is from Bob's collection. I couldn't resist.
Yeah, I mean, cars are about sex and death, and we've mostly been talking about death, so throwing in a little sex to keep your attention.
And apparently you can Google this and listen to it.
It's a famous country and western song, Devil Woman. So.
Could you sing a little?
No. But Marty Robbins was an amateur racer, and he sponsored racing teams and stuff.
And even more dangerous than the Dymaxion car was the Ford Giron, 1961. I don't think it even stood upright in the showroom.
Right, there's probably invisible wires on each side holding it up.
That's very Jetsons.
Right,
I love that.
yes.
I can't resist that. Of course, the stiletto, which we all wanted to have. This is really biographical material for Bob. So the car on the left is your first car.
It's a Dodge Dart Swinger, which my parents gave me for graduation, which I immediately traded in for the car on the right. It covered the down payment.
What year did you get the Swinger?
73.
Right.
So, and then I was off to the races after that.
So the BMW was the first car you wanted. Right. Then you went from BMW to Bugattis and all these incredible rare cars.
Right. This is a very interesting car because it belonged to King Leopold of Belgium, and it was given to him by Bugatti when Bugatti couldn't pay back money that Leopold had lent him. And, a lot of these car manufacturers were always a day late and a dollar short and trying to find rich pigeons to lend the money. So the king lent him this money, and they couldn't pay it back. And so Bugatti decided that he was going to repurpose a Type 59 race car as a road-going car, and he gave it to the king, and it sat in a garage for a long time. When I got it, it had only 2 coats of paint on it, the original blue and then the Belgian colors, which had been blown off by the exhaust, so you could see the original blue under it.
Right.
And we were going to talk about originality a little bit, so this is a good point. The car was, hadn't really been touched for 40 or 50 years, and I brought it back to America, and I instructed the restorer to get it running, but not to touch the seats or the paint or anything. And, there was horsehair coming out of the leather, which was torn, And I got an automatic invitation to the Pebble Beach concourse because this was a famous lost car.
Right.
And they assumed that I would, restore it to within an inch of its life.
Right.
And I purposely didn't. And I showed up with this car that looked like it had just rolled out of the barn. I could drive it onto the podium, which was a prerequisite of being there. And people flipped out,
Because the aesthetic then was totally like
Christmas
slick.
tree,
Yeah.
get out the toothbrush for the spokes on the wheels. And this sparked a big change because, people would come up to me during the concourse and say, how come you didn't restore it? And I'd say, after I bought the car, I ran out of money.
Right.
I didn't know what else to say, right? And now they have a category at Pebble Beach called the survivors, where people are bringing in unrestored cars that are being judged on their originality and patina, not on how well they're being, because a lot of these cars are restored to a condition that's better than when they were new. Right. But this was quite a beautiful car.
So was this the car that made you sort of change your mind about that? Or had you
No, I was
doing
doing, this was the most important car in the most original condition that had surfaced and had not been restored.
Yeah, because this is a good point, because when I got to know you again after we hadn't seen each other for a long time, I wrote about, I think it was Prouvé, I think you were just starting to find Prouvé houses and furniture. And you made that a big point in the piece, I remember.
Right, about like leaving the bullet holes in the house.
Right, all that, the Kalishnikov bullet holes.
Right, exactly.
And it came out, I was fascinated that it come out of that aesthetic,
because again, this is a different kind of restoration. This is a very famous Miller Packard cable special that Bugatti acquired from Leon Duray, aka the Black Prince, who took it to Europe and broke all kinds of records with it until the car broke, and he traded him a Bugatti, which Duray took back to Los Angeles and sold, and then Bugatti proceeded to copy the twin cam setup. Right. And this
did you fix this one up a lot? I mean,
I did fix this car up, but the car was a total wreck when I got it.
And you gave it to the Smithsonian?
And we gave it to the Smithsonian, where it's one of the more popular cars in the exhibit. But getting to the local angle here, I love this because this is a map of where the what they call round the houses races took place in Bridgehampton and Sagaponack before the track was built. So this ran from 1949 to 1953. Sponsored by the Lions Club, and it went from Bridge Lane to Main Street to Sagaponack Road and up Ocean Road. Then somebody got killed and they decided to build a racetrack.
That's what happened. Someone was like a bystander.
A car flew over the hay bales and crushed a few people, and the Lions Club said, I think we got to stop.
Yeah. So this was for June 10th, 1950. And this, you can go online. I was amazed to find the footage. Bridgehampton
I will say there's something called the Bridgehampton Heritage Racing Group, which are people who were friends of the racetrack who have done an amazing job of assembling all kinds of
incredible
material.
Footage.
They have a great archive, and they post a lot of this stuff online.
If I were more high tech, I would have been able to figure out how to get the video on here, but I'm not. My daughter's not around, so. But this is on one of the turns coming up through Sagaponack, right? The big potato fields there that's so familiar. Then this is the Bob takeover.
This is the map of the track as it was.
Who paid for this track?
Well, what happened was, this is a great story because this is something that would never happen out here now, but a group of people, mostly local, got together and they assembled 31 separate parcels of what were called non-contiguous woodlots, which were part of the land grants of the King of England in the 18th century, with Cooper's Neck and First Neck and all these other necks, and you got a non-contiguous woodlot where they came and they planted trees, because before these grants were given out, everything looked like a William Merritt Chase painting.
Right.
And so that's why we have all those trees up there. And they assembled all these parcels for like an average price of $6 or $7 an acre.
Right.
And then they had a subscription. So, when I got involved, the track had over 1,000 shareholders.
Amazing. Tell me that story. Back up for a sec. You came out here at a certain point, because that's when we reconnected. About what time was that?
The late 70s.
Late 70s,
I started coming out here in 76, 77.
Right. And was it was for sale, or did you go after it?
Well, in 1981, it was about to be sold to a real estate developer who subsequently went to prison. So we're not sure how that would have turned out. And I came in as kind of a white knight, bought a blocking share of
Right.
the company, and then fought with a bunch of other people until...
But soon after you bought it, well, you ran it for a few years as
ran
a
it
club.
for a long time.
Yeah, as a racetrack.
Almost 20 years.
Oh, that long?
Almost
Jeez,
20
I had no
years.
idea.
I mean, the decision to develop it was taken
Right.
10 years into it, but...
But the town of Southampton presumably did not want a racetrack. to
Well, it
be
was a
there anymore.
pre-existing non-conforming use that
Right.
had to go away
Right.
at some point.
Right.
But
And you fought with them to try to keep it a kind of a racing club, right?
for a
Some
long
kind of-
time.
Yeah.
For a
Yeah.
long time. But you can't have a racetrack where the community doesn't want it.
Right.
Indianapolis loves having the Indy there, but even Lime Rock is
Right.
something that, especially in a rising real estate market, nobody wants the noise.
Right.
And
And the pollution noise.
Right.
What was this? I was curious about
This
this.
was the timing tower, and
Right.
upstairs was where the press used to sit. There was actually like a little social club building just to the left there.
Cool.
It was a great grassroots
Cool.
kind of thing, but after the energy crisis, it was not going to. I mean, this is a great drawing of a starting gate that obviously never saw the light of day, but these great concept drawings of what.
But again, in your extended kind of, Bob has an amazing vision as a collector, because it kind of really includes everything, and he surfs that liminal space between, here it is, car racing track, and then it becomes a golf course, and somehow joining those things together. Not many people could do that.
Well, it was important to, a lot of golf courses are built on sort of blank pieces of property,
Right,
and this piece
right.
of property had a great
History.
sporting heritage. This is where Paul Newman met Mario Andretti
Amazing.
and started his race team.
Right.
When I first met Paul Newman,
At the Bridgehampton track, yeah.
he said to me, "Oh yeah, that's where I met Mario. It all started at the bridge." It was a great
Amazing.
moment. I've been talking to
Amazing.
Paul Newman about this.
Very cool.
I don't know who's the bigger stud, Paul Newman or Mario Andretti, but they're both
They're
pretty
kind
cool.
of tied, I think.
Right.
And then you go not just to golf. I mean, you didn't even like golf. I remember you talking about.
I didn't play golf.
Yeah.
I didn't.
But
play
the town said to you, look, we don't want a racetrack.
And it's zoned for
We'll do-
120 houses. I didn't.
Right.
I'm not.
You didn't want to do a development.
Right. So I thought this was a nice,
And then you
gentle.
speedily learned to play golf.
So I'm still learning. Still learning.
But not only golf, tell them a little bit how you preserved some of the famous corners and
Well,
some aspects
we
of
left
the bridge itself.
we left the bridge.
Yeah.
So you drive under the Chevron Bridge that you saw in the pictures, and we left the flag stations where the corner workers would wave
Right.
message flags at drivers. And there's actually a good piece of the track, the original track, still there. I have to patch it every few years because, all the members who own these fancy cars with low clearance complain about the potholes. But
Oh, it's-
where
Where is that near? Is it like near the 18th hole or something?
well, it starts under the bridge and
Right.
goes all the way to the maintenance building.
Right.
I mean, when people ask me, what would you do different? The only thing I would do differently is I would have left the entire track there.
Right.
But that didn't seem like a good idea at the time.
Right.
So
Did you consider that? I mean, when you were designing,
I
laying
was,
it out, was it a
no,
possibility? Yeah.
The problem is I didn't really know how this would work out. It's a
Right.
very speculative.
Right. I mean, it's such a cool
Thing.
idea. But you were also incorporating installation art and
Yeah, I mean,
That
because a golf course is like a picturesque garden.
Yeah.
It takes you to certain places in a predetermined sequence. And so
Whose piece is that?
this is a Scottish artist whose name I'll remember probably an hour from now.
Okay.
Um,
Angus McDuff.
no. And it has nothing to do with golf. It actually refers to papal edicts that came out of Avignon in the 12th or 13th century when there was a heretic who was making all kinds of representations about what was going on and what kind of miracles he could perform. And there's another part of this series that says, hardly anything ever happens in heaven. And, you know, you can just see the Pope saying, there will be no miracles here.
That's great.
And
especially beside a
when
golf,
but also when I reached
hole.
out to the artist and I said, I put it on a golf course, he said, I'm a golfer, I never even thought of that. So.
It's very cool. And then this, I mean, coming full circle, here's the golf course, but once a year you do this mega car show.
Well, we're trying to be the Pebble Beach of the East. Right. And, you know, Pebble Beach has become a very corporate and stuffy event. In fact, my wife owns a very beautiful and original deux chevaux twin-engine utility vehicle, which is a wonderful example of crazy French engineering. And it was bought off the floor of the auto show in the Coliseum in like 62 or 63. It's called the Sahara. You can see pictures of it like climbing up 45-degree sand dunes and stuff like that.
The little deux chevaux with the truck thing in the back?
It's a normal deux chevaux, except it has two engines, one over each axle.
Cool.
And it came from a well-known car collector who, you know, kept it on Block Island for 50 years, and then he died, and it came to auction, and nothing had ever been touched. Right. And after we got it, I called up the Pebble Beach people. I said, hey, remember me? I haven't been there in 20 years, but I got another one for the survivor category. And they looked at the pictures and they said, you don't have anything heavier? And I said, never mind. And I hung up the phone and I started my own concourse, right?
So, when does this take place? September?
In September.
Yeah.
In September, we'll have the 5th edition coming up.
So this brings us to, again, where we reconnected was your interest in Jean Prouvé and that connection between your early experience with collecting cars, leaving them as they were. Now you're going into, you told me at one point that you got to know about Prouvé because you were looking for one-off cars, right?
I was actually going to an auction in France to buy furniture that had been made by Ettore Bugatti, not his brother Carlo, who made that kind of Syrian Art Nouveau furniture, but Ettore, the car guy, who for kicks made furniture out of car parts. So he made a pasta machine out of car parts and stuff like that. So I went to this auction, and I was outbid on all the Bugatti stuff, but there was this furniture by Pierre Chareau, which I had never seen before, and I bought some of that. And
so that was the first modernist furniture. Yeah,
that was the first architectural foray, and that led me very quickly to Jean Prouvé, who was pretty much unknown. You know, 20th century architectural history is dominated by Le Corbusier in France, and now, 30 years later, people understand that Jean Prouvé is the father of Renzo Piano and high-tech architecture generally.
And he was also a good socialist. I mean, he was making this housing, as we've talked a lot about, for workers. You know, he was an incredible metal worker.
He recognized that the main challenge of 20th century architecture was to house the homeless, which has only gotten much worse.
Which has gotten so much worse. Yeah. So this story was incredible. I wrote about it years ago, and you sent that guy, Eric.
Right.
It was such a character.
Because the
Indiana Jones.
The tropical house was in Brazzaville.
Right.
And you never referred to Brazzaville without it being preceded by the adjective war-torn Brazzaville, right?
Yeah.
So I didn't go myself. And
It was in the middle of a civil war, though.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And we took down the house.
How did you know that it was in Brazzaville?
I had seen it in a book that the French government had commissioned of modernist architecture in Africa.
And it said it was still there.
It was still there. Yeah. You know, it had holes cut in the panels for architecture, and there were people squatting in it.
For air conditioning,
for air conditioning, people squatting in it, but it was still there.
Yeah. So wasn't there a warlord at some point who was...
I didn't really ask too closely what Eric did to get it out of there, but he got it out of there.
And then
Here
he
it is
deconstructed it, yeah.
Yeah, here it is in the yard.
Outside of Paris,
Outside
right?
of Paris. And we restored the house, and we sent it to America, where it was reconstructed at Yale and at the Hammer. And then we donated it to the Pompidou.
Right.
And it's been exhibited on the terrace of the Pompidou. It's been exhibited in Brussels at one of their satellite.
Because it is kind of the mini-me Pompidou Center in a sense. It really is.
Jean Prouvé was the
seed
chairman of the jury that selected Piano and Rogers to design the Pompidou.
Yeah,
so there's
great
definitely a spiritual line there. So here's the house.
But you found more than one. Weren't there two
There
or three?
were two. There were two together.
Right.
And then there was a somewhat older one, so we took all three.
So in case some people here don't know about the Maison Tropicale, these were designed after the war when France was really in recovery, right?
Right.
And they were designed to fit into one of those French cargo planes, so they could go to colonial outposts, French colonial outposts, and very easily make. I mean, these were houses for government
Yeah,
officials.
actually for the head of the lycée in Brazzaville. Was
and even though they were metal in a tropical, they were supposedly pretty cool.
Yes, because of they borrowed from tropical architecture with the ventilation you can see in the
Was that true?
There.
I always wondered if that's true.
Yes.
It was pretty good.
Right.
And this is a story unto itself. I just did a piece this week. Bob kindly donated this to an amazing housing project in Tijuana by Teddy Cruz and Fona Foreman. This is a Jean Prouvé chair that you tell us the story.
Well, what's interesting about Prouvé is that until he went bankrupt, he ran his own business, and he made a lot of money making furniture like this for universities and schools and offices, and he plowed all that money back into these failed prototype experiments. And what's going on in Tijuana is experimental housing for migrants.
Hundreds of refugees.
Refugees at the fringes of Tijuana. This is not even the formal Tijuana. This is outside of Tijuana. And Teddy and Fana are designing very interesting multifamily housing projects that contain little businesses that the people who live in the house.
So it's very much in the spirit of Prouvé.
It's very much, yes.
Because it's sustainable, because they don't if they can't get across the border, they can stay. And they have a little space for some kind of business,
Yeah, so Teddy and Fana have been working on this kind of project for a long time. Yeah. And so my wife and I decided that we would donate this chair to auction, and I would say I fell out of my chair when it made $400,000. But it also, the fact that this chair would sell for $400,000 is a sign of the fetishization of this kind of stuff, that part of the reason in taking the house out of Africa in the first place was to demonstrate that Jean Prouvé was not just decorator fodder, that he was actually a committed
with a social vision,
with a social vision,
exactly.
and embodied in these housing projects. And so this financed the prototype house, and Alastair just filed an article with the New York Times about the project that'll come out
It's a magazine, in September. But what's amazing, talk about the scale of economies, or whatever the expression is. This little chair paid for the whole terracing of that decrepit hillside. I mean, this is a canyon that you cannot believe. It's such a chaos. And they terraced it with gabion walls. They built the first level of the housing project for 350 refugees. I mean, from that chair, kind of extraordinary. And then David Deutsch, following your lead, gave him another.
We were able to leverage this into another gift from another patron of a similar
who's an
magnitude.
artist, very interesting.
So now it's finished.
And then Bob never does anything in a small way, of course. And you heard about the Maison. This is the Maison de Verre, obviously, by Pierre Chareau. in the middle of Paris, and you heard about this?
Yes, and we really have Jean Prouvé to thank, because we had a little reception at the location where the tropical house was restored, and one of my professors from Columbia was there who knew the family.
Oh, Frampton.
Not Frampton, Brian Brace Taylor. And he said, Bob, you did a great job on the tropical house. You really ought to buy the Maison de Verre. And I was like, sure, why not? Bring it on. I mean, I said I didn't even know it was for sale. And he said, well, it's not for sale, but it needs to be bought, which I thought was interesting. And so my wife and I visited the house, and we thought, okay, why not? And, it's been 15 years.
And all that amazing experience you had from Prouvé, but also from the cars, and saving the patina, saving the old thing, you applied here.
Yeah, we've done an enormous amount of work on the house, and you can't really tell by looking at it. That's the object.
You even did the wiring inside the walls, which you can't see. But
right, all the wires are in tubes, and so we restored that. But one of the things I learned from restoring cars is that if you open the engine bay and you clean one piece, it makes all the pieces that you didn't clean look dirty.
Yeah.
So you can't really, you have to
don't start.
Yeah, exactly. So.
And then so much of the detail work here, which is so incredible, and obviously is Charot at his best. But it's so much like a car too, the parts of a car. I mean, the plumbing and the...
Yes, it's Ken Frampton described the house as a techno-surrealist masterpiece.
That about corners it. Yeah, it's amazing. And I remember when I visited you there was a graduate student writing just about his plumbing.
Right.
That was her dissertation was on
the plumbing of the Maison de Verre.
Yeah. What shape is it now?
Well, we're about to undertake the replacement of the courtyard facade. Right. The glass bricks are not the original glass bricks of the house.
Right.
And so we've collaborated with Saint-Gobain on replicating the formula, and now we have to go to the French authorities to convince them that the way we want to do this is the correct way. Right. But it'll be an interesting and controversial project. If you go back to the facade, that all of this black cross-banding is going to disappear, because that wasn't original to the house. The house had a much more dematerializing facade, which was just the glass bricks with the concrete infill. So people are going to be shocked because they've been looking at this picture for
forever.
Yeah.
You also told me about there were these amazing theater lights right at the top that had been stolen or taken off.
No, they took them down because it bothered the people upstairs, but we put them all back. They're not visible in this photo. But the house was lit with these theatrical projectors that hang outside the facade. Right. So it's like being in a fish tank.
Right. But you found some.
We had one.
Replicated. Yeah.
We had one, and we replicated the others. We left the mercury and stuff like that out of it, right?
In case people don't know, I'm sure everybody here does know, but in case you don't know, the whole idea, the structural idea of this house, and correct me if I'm wrong, Bob, came about because someone upstairs did not want to move out. Right. So they had to it was like, a bad tooth, kind of hollowing out a tooth and putting the structure in. So it had to be incredibly engineered.
Well, it's a great lesson in the idea that sometimes the greatest art is born out of constraints.
Right.
So they were going to knock down this house and build a house, and suddenly they couldn't build a house, they could just insert a box. And so the elaborate interior is a function of the fact that they really couldn't build a house. Right. They had to build it from the inside.
And who was the protesting resident?
No, there are different stories. It was like it's an old lady, it was a magazine, but they couldn't get them out. In France it's tough to evict people. Here it's easy, but over there it's pro-tenant. So
and even I remember bringing a group of museum directors to visit, and Bob was in a funky shirt fixing the wiring of this, the three-pronged
right, because they have different bells.
Well, he was a gynecologist.
Yes.
And then if you wanted to visit the family, you press the middle one.
Right.
And there were different sounds. Did you recreate that?
We haven't done that yet, but
Okay.
we know that there were different sounds.
Get on this.
It's on the long list, right?
And then service was for the
Right.
guys
Right.
delivering the croissants.
Right.
And another mega 20th century star, Bob cannot resist. This is the 50-foot, right, diameter fly's eye dome. One of Bucky Fuller's last iterations of the dome, the geodesic dome.
Right. This had been lying fallow as the property of the Fuller Foundation, and they sold it to me, and we restored it, installed it in Toulouse in France. We installed it in Amsterdam at some point, and then I remembered a saying of my Hungarian grandmother, "Your eyes are bigger than your stomach," and I sold it to Alice Walton. Yes, it's at Crystal Bridges, and it's beautifully installed at Crystal Bridges now.
But this is one of my favorite photographs of it, because it was actually
This looks
designed.
like from a Japanese horror movie
Yeah, it
in
is.
the 50s,
Exactly.
The Fly.
It looks much better without the
Yes,
eyeballs
it does.
in it. So Bucky did it for Los Angeles had its bicentennial in 1981, and this was kind of this was downtown Los Angeles, and it was kind of the information center, and they had a historic display beneath it of the history of Los Angeles. Then it was really just, it kind of disappeared, right? Because I remember, who was that nice guy who actually designed it?
Oh yeah, the surfer dude.
The surfer guy,
right.
who's still around.
Yeah,
I met him in San Diego a couple years ago.
His name will come back to me.
So they took it apart, put it in this barn, and then everybody forgot where it was, right? Until someone, I think, flew over, did a Google Earth search or something, right? And saw these bits sticking out of a rotting barn.
Right.
And that, is that when you, was it still in that barn?
No, they took it out and they put it somewhere, but they couldn't. There's another Fly's Eye Dome which has been installed in one of Craig Robin's shopping centers.
It's smaller.
Yeah, but it's a kind of, it really bothers me, the idea that it's a,
it's in the design.
Decorative sculpture in a shopping center.
Well, it gets you to the underground parking garage after you've been at Gucci and Hermes.
Please.
And this is when you were fixing,
we restored it in California with a fabricator who does a lot of work with contemporary artists making sculptures. I mean, these are fiberglass panels
components
that needed to be restored.
And then you hear it is being assembled in Toulouse. I forget the year of this. Do you remember?
6 or 7 years ago.
Yeah. And it was, what was the festival? I mean, it was sort of the
There's a Toulouse Arts Festival.
Arts Festival, yeah, it was wonderful.
Yeah.
Right on the river.
Yep.
So Crash, this goes back to our theme, our underlying theme. An amazing book came out in 1973 that I'm sure a lot of people here have read, but I love this quote by J.G. Ballard. Ballard is the guy who wrote Empire of the Sun. He grew up in Shanghai and was actually, as a child, was a prisoner of war of the Japanese.
He also wrote a book that was pulped. That was he wrote about. There was an essay in it called "Why I Want to Fuck Ronald Reagan."
There you go.
And they decided that.
Ballard did not.
Yeah, he was politically very incorrect.
And this book, if you haven't read it, I didn't really like the movie, but I love the book. And
this is a great quote. After being bombarded endlessly by road safety propaganda, it was almost a relief to find myself in an actual accident.
Well, it's sort of a convergence of the car, of crashes and sexuality, and on and on. Very politically incorrect now. And I felt very closely. So a year after that book came out, Chris Burden, the LA artist in Venice, California, had himself nailed to the roof of a Volkswagen. And then he, of course, had to show his Christ-like stigmata on his hands to prove that he really was. Chris also got shot, in the arm, and he put himself in a baggage locker for like 4 days.
Shot at an airplane.
He shot at an airplane.
Transgressive.
And he passed away, I think, a year or two ago.
Yeah.
Wolf Vostell, Wolf took a Cadillac and covered it in concrete.
Right.
And this again is a European more.
Right, and this is very prescient because this is years before the energy crisis.
This is it being restored, so you can see there is a real Cadillac underneath there, and they're tuning it up. And I said to Bob, I said, boy, it's amazing they could drive this. And Bob said, how could they drive, but you can't see this through the concrete? I'd never really thought
How do you
it through.
even get in it, Alastair? I mean, give me a break.
Well, they're getting kind of, they're tuning it up,
Right.
clearly. But, and this is so iconic, we all know this. But it really is a great piece of American art, I think.
And the year is significant because it's
74.
74.
Yeah. Cadillac Ranch, art and form, good, amazing, collaborative from the 60s and 70s. This is a later piece they did. They created this sort of Batmobile and drove it through a wall of burning television sets, which kind of, you don't really have to explain that. And this is your friend, and it's someone you collect for quite a while, Richard Prince. So tell us about this.
Well,
And there's one in the show.
There's a hood upstairs, which is, when he started making these hoods, they are not actual car hoods, they are fiberglass blanks, which you sent away from the back of car enthusiast magazines. And if you had a Dodge Challenger, for example, you could send away for a blank, and it would lighten the car. When you're trying to go faster, you put, you hollow out the doors and you do this. So typical of Richard's artistic practice, he was making high art out of lo-fi craft elements from some obscure subculture, in this case the car aftermarket, and that led him to make fragmentary sculptures out of pieces of car and work with Bondo, which is some really toxic shit you use to patch up your car body. And then, again, typical of his practice, he keeps going in the same vein, and in the next couple of slides you can see that he started to work with actual hoods. This is an actual hood, and then you have the velocity stacks. And the one on the right, which again goes back to Crash, this one is made out of an actual hood from a Gulf-sponsored Mercedes that ran at Le Mans and crashed. And so he acquired the hood and boxed it up, and this piece hangs at the bridge. It's what you see when you walk in.
Yeah, it's a beautiful piece. Does Richard though have any kind of political agenda or statement that he's making, or is it purely aesthetic as far as you know?
Well, with respect to the hoods, I think it's aesthetic. Richard is both celebrating car culture and undermining it at the same time.
How's he undermining it?
He's undermining it because he's recycling bits and pieces of it and abstracting it and pulling it away. It's like a nurse. He's making fun of the nurses, but he really wants a nurse to look after him.
Isn't he further fetishizing a fetishized fetish?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So I guess that's enough. Okay.
Yeah.
And it's an appropriation. These are just to end with, because Ron Arad does these. He loves these Fiat 400s, and he found a place in the Netherlands that can really crush something down to about an inch. And this is a full-size car that he flattens. Amazing place in near Amsterdam.
Yeah, I mean, it's really an homage to César.
Oh, totally César.
Because
and he admits
César
it. Yeah.
César did not have the technology to
Right.
flatten a car to that extent, so he flattened stuff like coffee pots and things like that. But if he had the technology, he would have.
Ron even calls these pressed flowers, which gives you an idea. So
Right.
really, with that, unless you have a whole lot more you want to say, we kind of tie it up. But if there are any questions, we'd love to be open to any of your questions. Yeah, Eric.
I have a question that goes back to the Warhol image of the car.
The crash, yeah.
And it was something you said that is what stuck with me. You said it was car crash in Seattle that somebody went to take a photo for Time Magazine. or
Newsweek, yeah, it was
Newsweek.
Newsweek, yeah.
And I want to know why. Like, was it famous people? Was it the most gruesome car crash ever?
It was a news story, totally.
I mean, is it like the first time the media turned its attention to?
No, if you look at Ouija, in the 50s, half his photographs are gruesome car accidents, because it's sold. you know, it sold tabloid newspapers. I mean, I'm surprised that it was for Newsweek, but.
But there must have been some interesting angle to the story
Well, if you
that would
look,
get it to Newsweek,
because
to rise to the level.
4 or
of
5
Newsweek.
people were killed.
Yeah, but I mean,
Yeah.
to go that far,
Yeah.
to,
I know.
to like find that kind of destroyer, it just seems incredible. Like there was something that hit it.
Well, it's a pretty gruesome image, yeah. And I don't know how Warhol came across it. Have you ever heard a story about that? I don't know. I mean, it's highly disturbing. And then it was about the same year he did the electric chair.
electric chair, right.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, those are his most incredible early pieces, really.
I heard a story about the electric chair that from somebody who shares Warhol's birthday
Uh-huh.
and met him, and Warhol, when he was introduced, he said that they share their same birthday, and he said, "Oh, and do you know?" And he named this person, and this person who was telling me the story was a young guy who wanted to so impress Warhol that he said, "Sure," right? And it turned out the person that Warhol named was the first person to ever get electrocuted back in whenever they first
Right.
did it,
Right.
and just happened to have the same birthday as Warhol. So I think there's a tie-in to why Warhol chose
Right.
that. Is that
Yeah, he was very into birthdays, as I recall. Maybe that was it. They're gruesome images. Any?
I heard that the electric chair was, he sent someone in to that place where they electrocuted, and it was the electric chair of Julius Rosenberg.
Wow.
And you're not allowed to photograph things like that, but he sent someone in, and they had a camera on the guy's foot that was like, there was like a thing in his pocket, and that's why if you look at the image, it's kind of up, it's upward facing to this electric chair. I heard that too.
Cool. Sort of cool. Kind of depressing. Yes.
Going back to the Batmobile concept car, but I thought it led, my mother had a Ford Fairlane 500 in 1957, and it had huge wings on
Right.
the back. So
Yeah.
it seems to me that from the 54, it was a wreck.
You probably know more about that than
Yeah,
I do.
look, there were some spillover into the
mass market.
the design
Yeah.
of the car. There was this guy Harley Earl who worked for General Motors, who designed all the fins and stuff. But they were basically bolt-ons to standard cars, whereas the concept cars tended to be more radical
Right.
in the conception of the
But
body.
wasn't the whole idea is that you'd see this thing, you'd almost faint because it'd be so
Right.
sexy and beautiful. And Playboy would always have a
Right.
huge spread on it, or Esquire
Right.
magazine. Then you go, well, I don't know, maybe I couldn't handle that. But pull back a bit, and you have the manufactured, mass market car.
Yeah, and
That sort
also
of has
bear
that.
in mind that they'd put fins on cars so that the neck, it's like whether pants are narrow or wide. It's
Right.
a question
Right.
of planned obsolescence. So the fins get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then they disappear. So
Right.
you have to keep trading the car in
Right.
for the next model.
And it was also early space age stuff.
Yeah.
Right? It was competing with jet
Right.
travel and all
Right.
that stuff too. Does that answer your question? I don't know.
Yeah, there was some superficial trickle down,
Yeah.
but nothing technological, just cosmetic.
Yes, April.
Is the interior of the Maison de Verre that you showed that has like ochre and black and gray, are those the colors that you have painted it?
Those are the original colors. There's orange paint. It's got reddish orange paint on the columns, which are also clad in slate, which is actually fire retardant. That's why the slate. Some people would say, well, it's Giraud's use of luxurious materials to take an I-beam and clad it in slate, but in fact, the slate is fire retardant, and whatever you saw in the picture is untouched.
The colors are so beautiful on that interior to me, especially
Yeah.
amazing plumbing, the amazing colors and textures of the plumbing. I really freaked me out.
That's a great photo by Todd Eberly, when we did that story.
Yes.
That's particularly good. But we should also mention, I mean, it is Chiro, but it's also the architect.
Yeah, it's a collaboration between Charot, a Dutch architect named Bernard Bevoet, and
The metalworkers.
and a metal worker named Dalbey, who made all of those wonderful staircases and bookshelves and everything on site. There was actually a forge in the courtyard for 4 years, and they would make something, and if they didn't like it, they'd make it again. And they were just...
There is nothing like it. I mean, it's amazing that you were able to acquire it. It's just an extraordinary house.
We were lucky.
Yeah,
We were lucky.
really amazing.
So you don't think that the glass house down at Steinbeck comes out of the...
It's close.
No, I would say that's the opposite, because that house is designed to be lived in by an exhibitionist. And the glass house has this opaque glass which is meant to hide you from the outside world.
But it also was hard to see. I remember for years you couldn't
Because
get
it's
in
behind
there.
it's behind
Yeah.
a portico door
Yeah.
on the
In a
street.
traditional Parisian courtyard.
Yeah, in the old days you could just walk in. You just
Right.
push the button and walk in.
Even
But
the concierge would allow you in.
It wasn't a question of the
Yeah.
concierge. What's his name? Glenn Merkett told me
Oh yeah.
that when he was walking around Paris in the late 50s or early 60s, he walked past it and the
There
portico was open.
Yeah.
Well, because, it was a practicing
Doctor. Yeah.
and so they didn't have codes on the doors and stuff. You pushed a button and you went in.
Any other questions?
I actually have another.
You have a follow-up?
No, it's not a follow-up, it's fresh. I'm just wondering, like, when you see all these cars, like, and I don't know if it's just having seen them before, the thin cars and all the fantasy cars and the prototypes, everything looked like it was just bursting with energy. And now I look at the roads and I see, like, SUVs, like, it just looks so boring, and they're all the same, and they're all just such big boxes.
They're all gray or black
And
or.
there's no like fantasy thing going on. And I know we've all been through a lot with cars and the energy crisis and everything. There's plenty of reason for people to feel weird about it. And then there's this kind of like me first kind of sense of like we have to have a big car because somebody else could run into you. So you're the one that has to survive.
You need that command seating position.
Right. Right.
That excess and yeah, that kind of entitled thing. But do you guys think that there's anything with if there are more electric cars coming, like that Wackola truck that Tesla designed, do you think that there's any that's supposed to be like you would drive it? Do you think that there's any possibility that there's going to be a little more invention that could happen, or do you think we're just trying to?
It's a great question. Yeah, because it really. Go
I
ahead.
think that like everything else, there's going to be a race to the top and a race to the bottom, and that cars will become, in the main, more and more appliance-like. You'll get in an electric car without a driver to go from A to B, and there'll be all this efficiency, which in some respects is wonderful, but it will have squeezed all the poetry out of the road. There'd be no such thing as the road. The road is just what takes you from A to B, and the idea that you're going to get in a car and wander somewhere is less and less. At the same time, there'll be more and more of these $1 million and $2 million supercars, which is where all the engineering and creative talent will be concentrated on making race cars and road-going cars. That segment will be smaller and smaller, but cars will become more and more what you're talking about is cars becoming more and more appliance-like.
They're appliances. Like we've been talking about how the images in this show so exhibit the extension of the body into the vehicle as if it were an exoskeleton. And that really is predicated on someone driving it so that you control it, and it's an exterior version of yourself in some way. Cars become appliances and they're all automatically driving themselves, then
be like taking the subway or a bus. There won't be any distinction there.
So
And
it'll like, I think it will kind of ruin our extended imagination of our own.
yeah,
Well, as a form of expression, absolutely.
Yeah,
And you're
and-
right about that. I mean, it's been years. You know, if you think of the 70s, up through the 70s, maybe into the 80s, everybody had funky cars and cool, or painted hippie vans or whatever. The only equivalent to that now that I've seen, and being in part of my time in rural Pennsylvania, are the Trump trains, you know, not now, because they're kind of quieted down. But 6 months ago, and these huge pimped out trucks, pickup trucks, but huge, not the normal pickup truck, with 20 of these, you know, giant Trump flags, and very proudly driving around in groups. I mean, really intimidating. That's the only, you know, when you said that, I thought, yeah, she's right. You're really right. It's you don't have that. The highway's no longer for that expressing your individuality at all. And that was such an American. I mean, I think you go to Mexico, you go to Central America, you know, and those buses and the trucks are still hand painted and everything. They're incredible. Yeah. In Cuba, yeah, Cuba where they have to, right? 'Cause of
right.
the, you know,
And or if you go to New Mexico and you go to the lowrider
Yeah,
enclaves,
those are
in
cool.
Espanola,
Those are
those are like you know,
Right.
deep subcultures.
Have you ever gotten into that?
Yeah, I love lowriders. I'm going to bring a group of lowriders to the bridge one of these years. So, well, we had the Liz Cohen lowrider. We had it at the bridge.
Do they get to play golf then?
Why not? Why not? No, but when we had because there is a Liz Cohen in the show.
Yeah.
She brought the car, and I had gone to school with one of the producers of Breaking Bad, and we were able to get the Narco Corrida band that sings about Heisenberg, you know, from Breaking Bad, and we flew them out and they played music for the show. It was fantastic.
Fantastic. So you've had a little glimpse of a cross-section of Bob Rubin's brain.
I think the
This
lowrider subculture is one of the, you know, remaining pockets of resistance, right?
Yeah,
Because
definitely.
if this electric car thing keeps going and we become totally applianced out about it, the internal combustion engines will be outlawed,
Right.
and then you'll need some kind of a special permit to drive a vintage car,
Right.
you know, and I mean, they should get rid of carbon fuels,
Yeah, of course.
but
There'll be a way around it. There'll be some form of expression. So
well, what's
I'm sure.
happening now, which is interesting, is you take your Jaguar XKE and have it turned into an electric car. So
Right,
it's kind of
right.
like an
Yeah, I've heard
advanced,
about that.
an
Yeah.
advanced resto mod, you know.
Right.
It's
It's like I collect vintage typewriters, and there's a guy in Philadelphia who will take your vintage typewriter from the 50s and make it a computer. Somehow, he puts a bar in there, sort of retro steampunk or something
Right,
like that.
right, that's
Any other questions back there? Sarah?
This is actually just a shameless plug. On August the 27th, Liz Cohen will be here to talk. So,
okay.
Wonderful.
just
Wonderful.
following up on what Bob was saying.
Great, thank you. One last question, anybody? Yeah? Hey.
What was, in your opinion, the height of car design, stylishness, elegance, functionality?
That's really a tough question. That's really a tough question because, you know, you had all these great cars before the First World War, and then you had the flowering of Bugatti in between the wars and Alfa Romeo, and then Ferrari and Maserati after the wars. It's tough.
Come on, if you had to pick one, Bob.
The 1962 Ferrari GTO. But
Pretty amazing.
That's
They're
that's
clapping.
Yeah, that's.
What do you drive now? I'm not even sure. You did drive the De Chauveau for a while, I remember.
Yeah,
that
the
was pretty
Chauveau,
cool.
The De Chauveau is you can drive it to the beach and back, but you know it's
How fast can it go? High
well
speed?
with one engine it goes the speed of a normal De Chauveau.
Right.
With two engines engaged, it only goes about 25 miles an hour because it's
That's all you need.
it's a
That's
utility.
good.
It's a utility vehicle.
Oh, very cool.
And we drive an appliance. And
Do you still have that old Jag?
No,
No.
no. But there's the ex-Sammy Davis Jr. 1977 Rolls Royce in the parking lot there. But I'm only driving that because our son has our appliance tonight. So.
Okay, yes.
Question.
Sure.
We're doing if you could choose one,
Well, if somebody wants to go whole hog, they can buy the Lovell Health House in Los Angeles right now, the Richard Neutra House.
We never mentioned the Motherwell House, by the way, but that's
Right.
okay.
Right, the
We'll
Motherwell
pass on
House is
that.
gone,
Yeah,
so we can't
yeah,
really.
we should have saved that. That
But-
was a
right,
terrible
that's-
moment.
Right, that's how
Yeah.
Alastair and I reconnected
Yeah.
in 1985.
Yeah. We were
But-
trying to save the mother. I mean, here it was Bob Motherwell's house, designed in large part by Pierre Chareau. You know, this incredible combination. He not only did the house, he did a studio for Bob, and he also did a little house for himself, where he died, where Chareau died. Chareau is buried, by the way, in the Roman Catholic cemetery in East Hampton, if anybody wants to pay homage. Yeah, pretty amazing. It's a tiny little grave right near the Bouvier, what's called the Bouvier Pie, which is where all the Bouviers were buried.
The Motherwell House, the Quonset house?
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
yeah. So he basically said, Bob got a little money. His father died, he inherited a bit of money. He went to Chareau, who he knew, who was an emigre from the war, and said, can you do something with this? I don't have that much money. He bought a beautiful place in East Hampton, which was very cheap after the war. And Chareau said, you know, I'm fascinated by these Quonset hut kits. You could get one for $100. So they ordered a couple. These trucks came and dumped all these parts on the lawn, and they figured it out. But I mean, it wasn't just a Quonset. You know, he did a.
It was a piece of a greenhouse.
Yeah, well, they recycled an industrial greenhouse from the
greenhouse,
North Fork. They excavated the whole lower floor and sort of put it up. And it was brilliant. I mean, it was just brilliant. The floors were made out of old oak that they cut up and then set in concrete. And the woman who owned it afterward, or the wife of Barney Ross, would hide her cocaine in there. She admitted to me, yeah, she confessed to me, because one of the oak bits, little kind of like cobblestones, could be pulled up, and she would hide her drugs in there. But it was, you know, it was a great loss, and it's true. Bob's right. We kind of connected on that again. And then he's now living in the Maison de Verre. Any other questions, or should we just wrap it? I want to thank Sarah and Eric and April and everybody who put this together. And the show was wonderful, and thank you very much.
The whole project of the church is fantastic.
It's brilliant. Oh, and Lee Skolnick, especially, the architect who did this place, who should have a round of applause right now. Thank you all very much.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
coming.